Lubbock, thoroughly enjoy being there. During the entire time that I've been in Lubbock, I've done some adjunct teaching at Lubbock Christian University, teaching primarily courses in church leadership and preaching at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. And so when we began talking about church dynamics, I feel like I've got a background that has taught me a couple of things. I'm very, very grateful for that. Don't know how familiar you might be with the Seibert Institute at Abilene Christian University. A brother by the name of Charles Seibert for many, many years taught ministry at ACU, worked with churches. In fact, Charlie was probably in a church setting 40 weekends out of the year, many times working with churches as they walked through transition or as they experienced conflict, but also teaching and guiding leaders through the years. After his death a few years ago, ACU determined that they wanted to develop an institute that focuses on church relationships. And so the Seibert Institute, named in his honor, was created. Carson Reed is the director of the institute, a good friend of mine. And so since my retirement, in a very limited way, I've done some work with the Seibert to take the church health assessment. Carson will assign one of us who works as consultant with the Institute. He will assign one of us to do some work with the churches. And so it's been my great pleasure to be able to interact with the church here in Summerville. A lot of preparation prior to coming in yesterday. And even though I had not met anyone in person until yesterday, I felt like I knew you well because of the assessment and because of the interactions, especially with Lynn and Don Allen by phone and Zoom before I came in. So thank you for the privilege of being with you today. I'm going to spend time during the assembly this morning looking at the first three chapters of the book of Ephesians. During this period, before we begin talking about the assessment itself, I want to read from Ephesians chapter 4. Anytime we look at the life of the church, no matter what aspect of church life we're talking about, I think we need to root deeply our thoughts and our perspectives in Scripture. And this text in Ephesians 4, I think, speaks to what you've done in taking this assessment. So Ephesians 4, 16 verses, kind of a lengthy reading, but if you'll bear with me, and let's hear these words from the Apostle Paul. He says, "As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But to each one of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascended mean except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. And so Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers. In other words, he gave gifts to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. And then we'll no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind and teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work." So Don Allen told me I had about 2 hours during this Bible class period. I wish we had time to fully explore that text, but let me offer a couple of observations, again, kind of leading into the comments I will make regarding the church health assessment. Paul begins that section, and it is a break in the book of Ephesians. Paul begins that section by saying, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. I urge you. It's an incredible little Greek verbal form, sometimes translated I urge, sometimes I beg, I beseech you. It is a word that is only used about 15 times in the entire New Testament, and as one of my Greek professors said many, many years ago, when you see this word, it's one of those words that says you need to sit up and pay attention. This is mainstream stuff. Because anytime New Testament writers, primarily Paul in his epistles, anytime New Testament writers use that verbal form, I urge you, they're getting ready to focus on what matters most in terms of lifestyle. And so I urge you to walk worthy of the calling you have received. And if you go back and look at the opening paragraphs in the book of Ephesians, Paul makes very clear that the calling is for us to be holy people, people who are fully devoted to Jesus, people who are faithful witnesses to the gospel of Jesus, to the world in which we live. I urge you to walk worthy of the calling you have received. And woven into that high calling in chapter 4 is Paul's encouragement for these folks to maintain the unity of the Spirit. And so even as we talk about doing an assessment, kind of gauging where you are as a church, I would begin by reminding you of how very, very important it is for you to be committed to one another, for you to be committed to the body of Christ in this place, for you to pursue that spirit of unity. But what is so fascinating is Paul doesn't say it is our job to build the unity. Paul doesn't say it's our job to create the unity. Paul says it's our job to maintain the unity. Because you see, it is a unity created by the Spirit of God. And so, no matter how similar your backgrounds may be, the reality is, in the midst of all of the diversity that exists in any church, God has brought us together through His Spirit to be one. We were baptized by one Spirit into one body. We are one. We are united because of the work of God, because of the work of the Spirit. And our task, our responsibility, is to make every effort to maintain that unity, which means we're patient with one another, we're tolerant with one another, which means in those moments when we disagree with one another, we don't start drawing up sides, don't start creating walls and barriers, but we make every effort to maintain that unity. And it's also fascinating as that text continues to unfold, as Paul describes different gifts in the body, he begins by talking about gifts of leadership. And so apostles and prophets and then pastors and teachers. You're blessed in this church with a group of shepherds, a group of elders. You're blessed with others who are in key leadership roles, whether that's staff or deacons or ministry team leaders. And Paul says those folks have been gifted with a gift of leadership in order to mentor, in order to train, in order to equip God's people for works of service. And I got to tell you, I was not only overjoyed, but I was amazed by some of the words I heard yesterday as a conversation took place regarding the way that you are structured and the way that you function, ministry leaders, deacons who incorporate others into their different ministry areas, who utilize the gifts of different people in this church. And so if you are part of this church and you're not involved in ministry, from an outside perspective, I'm also here to tell you that you've got a bunch of leaders who are ready and anxious and willing to work with you and to equip you and to mentor you so that together you grow up as the body of Christ in this place to be a mature body of believers. And so on the front end, I want you to hear me affirm what I'm seeing as I come in from an outside perspective, having never been in Summerville, South Carolina before in my life. What a blessing it's been to get to know this church just a bit. Now, let me transition And for the remaining time that I've got during this Bible class period, we're going to talk about the church health assessment. And so as I mentioned, the Seibert Institute at ACU does a variety of pieces of work with churches. Again, Carson is the overall director, but there are probably 7 or 8 of us who are consultants who do work as Carson connects us with churches. And so it may be a consultant who goes in and spends 4, 5, or 6 months interacting with a church over that period of time. It may be purely a weekend that you spend with a church. But one of the tools that the Seibert Institute has used for the last several years is this tool called the Church Health Assessment that measures 9 factors of congregational life. And so the question is, how well are you doing in those different areas? I used the illustration yesterday when I was talking with leadership. I used the illustration of pre-marriage counseling. I've done pre-marriage counseling most of my ministry career, and I use an inventory called Prepare Enrich, an inventory that measures 10 aspects of married life. And so on the front end, before a couple gets married, we're talking together about what is it that makes a healthy marriage, and how well are you doing in areas like communication and conflict resolution, etc. And with each one of those core areas in the Prepare Enrich inventory, there is a percentage that will come back to me. They take the inventory. I get about a 25-page document filled with data. And so when I begin to work with a couple in pre-marriage counseling, I've got a lot of data on the front end, kind of the same way in terms of the data with this church health assessment. And it's always fascinating. You'll understand what I'm saying here in just a moment. It's always fascinating when I'm working with a couple that they will come back in after having taken the inventory, first session together, and they will say, "So did we pass?" And my response is always, it's not a pass-fail. Rather, it is an inventory that kind of measures where you are in these areas. And so if you score in the range of 70, 80% in any of these categories, then that means that the two of you are basically in agreement with one another as we talk about different aspects of communication or conflict resolution. If you begin scoring at 20, 30, 40%, may not necessarily be a weakness, but it is certainly an area that we want to spend some time talking about. It is a growth area. And so as the folks who put together this assessment, they kind of approached it from the same vantage point. And when you see the percentages here in just a little bit, then you'll hopefully identify with that as well, because it's not a pass-fail, but rather it is a question of, so how well are you doing in these areas? So you see on the screen the 9 different factors that are measured by this church health assessment. And I want to walk through those 9 just very quickly, give you a feel for what was involved when you took the inventory. By the way, took the assessment. And by the way, you did this back in late November, early December. There were 152 of you in the Somerville Church who took this assessment. And that is an incredibly good percentage compared to churches across the board who have taken this assessment through the years. In fact, as the Seibert Institute has worked with churches, I think somewhere in the range of 150 plus churches have taken this church health assessment. And anytime a church comes close to 50% of Sunday attenders taking the inventory, that's good, because for a Sunday morning attendance of 300, which is kind of where you are, a Sunday morning attendance of 300, you factor in the fact that you've got children, you've got teenagers who would not have taken the inventory, and so 50% of you took the inventory, and yet when you consider adults, an even higher percentage. And so kudos again to you in terms of your response. And I'll also tell you on the front end, before we even talk about all 9 factors, I'll also tell you that your overall percentage scores, again, don't think pass-fail, but your overall percentage scores are above average compared to the other churches that have taken this assessment through the years. And so even before coming in and interacting with leadership yesterday, I came in convinced that I was going to have the privilege of working with a church that is healthy. Doesn't mean you guys are perfect. In fact, it's kind of like, we talked about this yesterday, it's kind of like, give me a word or a phrase that describes the Somerville Church. And that might range all the way from, well, the Somerville Church is a generous church, or we're conservative, or we're progressive, and somebody yesterday said we're a friendly church. And my question was, well, one, you've just described the church as if it were a person with a life of its own. The Somerville Church is a friendly church, but then my question was, so are all 300 members friendly? And the answer was no. Now, I'm not going to describe any of the names that were mentioned yesterday. But as one of my buddies put it years ago, in any church that is healthy, in any church that is friendly, there's probably a couple of old sore heads somewhere. So just be aware, none of us are perfect as a church. You guys are not perfect, and yet you are a healthy church in my judgment. And again, I'm very, very grateful for that. And so these 9 factors, there were 75 questions altogether in those 9 areas. And so in some of the areas, there may have been 5 questions, other areas, 7 or 8 questions, and then there were some demographic questions that we'll reference very quickly toward the end of the presentation. But walk through these 9 with me. Vision, mission, and goals. Is the vision or the mission of the church clearly stated? Does the congregation understand and identify with the overall mission that has been stated? And does the congregation pursue that overall vision? Are you leaning into, is that mission helping you honor the kingdom of God in this place? Second category, ministry and activities. Do your ministries function well? Do they meet the needs of the congregation and the community? Are members of this church able to utilize their gifts as they engage in those ministries or participate in those programs? Third factor is family stages, or stages of family life. And there are several areas that were measured by this particular category. And so what about youth ministry? What about children's ministry? What about older adults? What about intergenerational relationships with one another? But also some very specific questions related to singles and young adults and parents and young couples. Spiritual formation or discipleship. Does the church help me to grow spiritually? Am I engaged in praying? Am I part of a small group or a class? Am I engaged with the community? The category of worship. Does worship help me to encounter God, to lead a more Christ-like life? What about the preaching? What about the singing? How do I feel about those areas of worship and how they contribute to my spiritual life? Congregational culture and values. What about the morale that exists in the life of the church? Are members loyal to the church, loyal to one another? Are they committed to the church? A category of leadership, and there were more questions related to leadership than any other category, because part of what the assessment seeks to do is to focus on how well leadership is doing as they provide guidance for the life of a church. And so there were more questions that focused on leadership. And if you took the assessment, you may recall that the instructions for this category were for you to focus on the more formal leadership that exists in this church. And so you think in terms of elders or staff or deacons. And there were statements or questions that related to the integrity of your leadership. Do they work together well as a team? How do they deal with change? Do church members trust them? Do they trust one another? Next category was church relationships. Relationships within the church, a sense of belonging, a sense of care for one another. And then a final category that focused on finance and facilities, budget, questions related to how generous is the church. Is the budget clearly articulated and shared with the church? Do we understand? What about our facilities? Do they meet our needs, etc., etc.? And so 9 different factors that are measured by the assessment. If you were talking about qualities of a healthy church, we could probably identify another 9 factors, but these 9 factors, just like what I said regarding a prepare and enrich inventory for premarital couples, I think these 9 factors are at the heart of here's what a healthy church looks like. And again, you guys scored extremely well in all of those categories. Go to the next slide, and hopefully you can see that, because that slide gives you the percentages for each of those 9 factors. And so we're going to camp there for just a few moments, and then there are slides for each of those factors that we will move through very, very, very quickly. But this slide for just a moment. So you see, first of all, there are color-coded areas. And so to your far right, green, and then yellow, and then red. Again, do not think in terms of pass, fail. You know, if you were in school and you brought a report card home to your parents and you had an 80%, your parents, just like I would have done with my kids, your parents might say, "Good night, how did you end up with a C? Or how did you end up with a D? How did you end up with an 80% when 100% was possible?" Well, again, keep in mind, if you were to score 100% in any of these categories, that would mean that everybody who took the assessment strongly agreed with every statement. And that's not going to happen because of the diversity that exists in the life of any church. But the green areas, again, anything that is in that area, you are doing extremely well. And so again, I pat you on the back in terms of the kind of health that I think exists in this church. And if you look closely at that slide, there are 3 factors where the church scored at 80% or above. 81% in relationships toward the bottom there. And again, it was wonderful to listen in on the conversations yesterday. The fact that you care deeply about one another, that relationships run deep, that you're there for one another when you're walking through both the good moments and the challenging moments of life. And so relationships that run deep in the life of this church. Yeah, amen. And you also scored at 81% in the category of discipleship or spiritual formation. In other words, the things that are happening in the life of this church, all the way from worship to classes to small groups, to ministries, those things are helping you to grow in your walk with Christ in all of the different pieces of what it means to be more spiritually formed into the image of Jesus. And so again, to score at 81% is phenomenal. And then in terms of vision, at 80%. And I shared with the group yesterday, I did some exploring on your website, and then even some of the banners that I've seen in the church building where your vision is very clearly articulated, and then even underneath that on the website, a different set of values that grow out of that. And then I know over the last few years, your leadership has also led you in developing a couple of strategic plans. The first strategic plan that focused more upon an internal focus. How do we grow? How do we become more like Jesus? How do we love each other more deeply? And then the more recent strategic plan that is focusing on loving your neighbor. Shared with a group yesterday, the Monterey Church where I preached for all of those years, our mission statement was love God and love others. And then we had a set of values that grew out of that. Same thing with you, where you're able to say, here's our vision, here's our mission, here are the beliefs or the values that drive us. And when those have been clearly articulated, then anytime you begin talking about ministries or programs, the questions that come are questions like, so does this ministry, does this activity, does this program help us to honor our mission and our vision as a church? And again, it's been such a blessing to hear about the different ministries that exist in the life of this church. You're not just choosing to do another ministry because somebody kind of likes the idea, but you're choosing to engage in ministries or initiate new ministries or new activities because you believe that those will honor your overall mission. It also gives you a framework to evaluate. And so whether it's pausing like leadership did yesterday, once a year in kind of a planning session to say, we're going to pause and we're going to do some evaluation, or whether it's looking at a ministry and saying, while this ministry may have been very effective in the past, it is no longer serving a purpose to honor our mission. And so maybe it's time for this ministry to go away. Kind of tongue-in-cheek, yesterday I asked the question, so how many of you remember bus ministry days? Anybody remember bus ministry days? Some of the churches I worked with early in my ministry, we were heavily involved in bus ministry, where we would spend Saturday mornings knocking doors in the community, and then on Sunday picking up kids with those buses. And that bus ministry served its purpose in many, many ways. But just like gospel meetings, for example, which I would not encourage churches to do in today's world, that was very effective in the 1950s, 1960s perhaps, but likewise, bus ministry may not be the most effective outreach tool today. And so I mentioned yesterday I was a part of two different churches where we helped, pardon the language, we helped kill the bus ministry. And we had folks who were significant volunteers in the bus ministry who would say things like, well, I guess you guys don't believe in evangelism anymore, do you? And our response was always, no, we're stepping back to evaluate, is this ministry being effective? And if it's not being effective, then let's begin to explore other ministries, other initiatives that will help us to honor our overall mission. But I hope you see what I'm saying. The importance of a vision. Is it clearly articulated? Do we know where we believe God is calling us? And then that sets the stage for talking about ministries and activities. So you've got three factors that were all 80% or above. And then you've got another 5 factors where you scored 75% or above. Worship was at 79%. Really looking forward to sharing worship with you this morning. Leadership at 78%. And then ministries and activities, congregational culture and budget, all at 75%. Again, incredibly high. Even though they are kind of in that yellow category, those are still strengths in my judgment. If you were to look in great detail at the results of the inventory, probably one reason all of those score in the range of 75% is because there may have been 6 or 7 or 8 questions underneath that overall factor, and you may have scored 80% with 2 or 3 of those, but you may have scored 60, 65% with the others, and so the overall average for that particular category ended up being 75%. And then you scored lowest, even though it's not a low score, you scored lower in this area of family or stages of family life. And that particular factor measured, so how well are we doing with children's ministry? And I probably didn't look as closely at it as I needed to, but I think you scored higher there than anywhere else. For any of you, and probably many of you are not involved in children's ministry since children's classes are going on right now. But you scored extremely high in children's ministry and in youth ministry and intergenerational connections, in senior adults, etc. Where you scored lower, and this is true for many churches, where you scored lower was, are we engaging, ministering to singles or young adults, 20-somethings, like we should? What about ministries and programs to parents or to young couples? And those scores were lower, which then brought the overall score in this category down just a bit to 72%. But pause with me for a moment and just look at that. Because again, I want you to hear me say, you are a healthy church in my judgment. I'm just one voice, one outside perspective, but in my judgment, you are a healthy church. And so I think anytime we talk about these factors, it is a matter of asking, so what are our strengths? And you've got several on here. And with our strengths, how do we build upon those? How do we leverage those to engage in even more ministry? And maybe how do we leverage some of those to address some of the needs that exist or some of the growth areas that exist? And so when we talk about strengths, it's not a matter of saying, okay, we've got 3 strengths, and you kind of dismiss them then as though everything is going well. No, it's a matter of saying, how do we build upon those? Just like, again, when I'm doing pre-marriage counseling, if they score extremely high in an area of communication, then my question is, so how do we leverage your gifts or your skills in communication to address the fact that you scored extremely low on finances or budget. And interestingly enough, in pre-marriage counseling, many times a couple has never even talked about finances or budget to that point. Or how do you leverage conversations regarding children and parenting when that day comes? If your communication skills, gifts are good, then how do you leverage that? Same thing I would suggest with these factors. And then you began looking at the areas where you scored lower. Again, not necessarily weaknesses, even though that may be the case. I prefer to use the term growth areas. And so you begin to look at some of those areas, and you begin to do some brainstorming. Again, are there ways that we can leverage some of our strengths to address that? But even beyond that, let's do some brainstorming. And we did some of that yesterday during the lunch hour, and hopefully set the stage and planted some seeds for ongoing conversations to take place among your staff and elders and deacons and ministry leaders, and hopefully to involve you as well in that journey. All righty, tighten your belt. We're going to move very, very quickly, and you're going to see a slide for each one of these 9 factors. So go ahead to the next one, if you will. And with each one of these, I'm going to make just a comment or two, and we're going to keep moving. And so with mission and values and goals, again, you scored at 81%. And again, I would affirm I love your vision and value statements, relationships formed, faith strengthened, 4 particular values, belong, grow, serve, share, and then the strategic plans that you've been working on as well. There were 5 statements or 5 questions in this category, and 4 of the 5 were above 80%. Lowest score, 70%, was in the area of what they call innovation, change, if you please. Not change for the sake of change, but rather are we open to initiating new ministries, new ideas. And again, 70% is not a bad score, but you did score lower there than in any other category. And yesterday I referenced 1 Corinthians chapter 9, one of my favorite texts in the New Testament when we began talking about ministry. You may remember that's the text where Paul says, if I'm ministering or preaching to Jews, then I become a Jew. If I'm preaching or ministering to Gentiles, then I'm like a Gentile, a non-Jew. I become all things to all people for the sake of the gospel, in order that I might reach as many people as possible. I had a professor a number of years ago who used the words identity and adaptability, that our identity is firmly rooted in Jesus. We don't budge from there. And so what are our core beliefs? We don't budge from there. But in the midst of talking about our identity in Jesus, then we're willing to be adaptable. We're willing to adjust because we live in a changing world. The world in which I do ministry today looks very different from the world I did ministry in when I started ministry in the 1970s. And so we learn to be adaptable. We learn to think outside the box. And again, I've seen evidence of that here, but I encourage you to continue to think in those directions as well. Next category, activities and ministries. Again, you scored extremely well. A couple of statements in this category, similar to other factors as well, is your connection with your community, and are you meeting the needs of the community? And so I think one of the questions that churches need to be constantly asking is, so who is our community? And you're in an unusual situation in Summerville because you've got folks driving in, I understand, some of you as far as 30, 45 minutes away. And so community may take on different definitions as you begin thinking about the larger community, but then as you also begin thinking about the community that is closer in proximity to the church building. What about the community within a mile or 3 miles or 5 miles of the church? Are there particular needs that you can meet? Are there other churches that you might be able to partner with? Are there community agencies that you might be able to partner with? And how are we tapping into the gifts that our church family has? Stages of life ministry. Again, just the observation that you're doing so well when it comes to things like youth ministry and children's ministry, even though I know some transitions are taking place with youth ministry, but still extremely high scores, lower scores related to singles, young couples, young adults, etc. And as I shared even with a group yesterday, I think that is a challenge for most churches in today's world. How do we minister to 20-somethings, those who are transitioning from high school to college and then from college to young adult life, whether we're talking about those who are single or those who are newly married. And so again, hopefully some good conversations that will take place in the days and weeks and months to come as you explore how might we better meet some of those needs. Spiritual formation and discipleship, again, very, very quickly there, one of your higher scores. Worship, again, one of your higher scores at 79%. Lowest category here related to inviting others to worship. And the score was at 58%. Only 58% of those who responded indicated that they were comfortable with or that they invite others to worship. And I would make two observations. One is, it's a challenge always for us to step outside of our comfort zones to invite others. But secondly, that is typically a pretty low score for every church that takes the church health assessment, because it is so easy for us to become comfortable in our environment and comfortable with the relationships that we have. And so inviting others sometimes is a stretch beyond our comfort zone. But again, a challenge for you to do that very thing. Next category, congregational culture and values. Again, morale extremely high. One of the lower areas here has to do with keeping and recruiting volunteers, which is a challenge for every church that I've ever worked with. And yet the 65% score in that area is actually higher than most of the churches that we work with. And so volunteer recruitment for ministries, children's classes many times are some of the more challenging areas. Leadership, again, at a high category. So glad to see the results of an assessment where it looks like the church trusts the leadership and the leadership trusts the congregation and that they work together well as a team. Again, the ability to adapt to change, to handle criticism, a little bit lower scores there, but again, that's not uncommon when we talk about how any of us deal with change or how any of us handle criticism that may come our way. Relationships at church, again, incredibly high, speaks so well of the sense of belonging that exists here and the deep love that you have for one another. And then finally, finances and facilities, budget related, your conviction that you're a generous church, that you feel good about the budget and the resources needed to do ministry in this place. Lowest score there had to do with understanding budget, but that's also kind of a catch-22. Where many of us may want to know some more details, but we do not want to sit through a 60-minute presentation of a budget either. And so it's a catch-22 in that respect. So those are the 9 factors in a little bit more detail. Again, if you want to see copies of that, check with the staff, and they can help point you in those directions as well. And then very, very, very quickly, some demographic slides. And so go ahead to the next one. And so again, of the 152 people who responded to the assessment, what is their level of involvement in the life of this church? 85% at 3 or above. Average or above average. Again, an extremely good score. Level of attendance, the next category, 99% of those 152 respondents indicated they attend at least once a week, with 70% attending more than once a week. Length of membership, 40% plus, indicating they've been a part of this church for 20 plus years, but 42% also indicating they've been here for 9 years or less. So a good diversity in terms of how long have you been a part of this church. And then 2 categories. One was, so what do you like best, or what do you like most? And there were 16 different items to choose from. Worship activities, leadership, preaching, Bible classes, etc. 29% of the respondents put all of the above. And so 29% of the respondents like everything that's going on in the life of this church, and that's good. 19% relationship, sense of community, 10% feeling cared and loved for. There were just a few folks who indicated other, where you were able to write in what you like most. And so, single responses in that category. And then the category of what do you like least? Again, 16 items to choose from. 50% of respondents put none of the above. In other words, we love what's going on in the life of this church. 9% put other, And there were 14 responses there, and that may have ranged all the way from how we do communion, how leadership is structured, but again, just a single response from 14 different folks. 8% indicated lack of outreach, and again, community outreach was kind of a thread that was woven through a lot of things in the assessment. And so, again, prayerfully, ongoing conversations about how do we reach out to our community. Age-wise, 47% of the respondents were 65 or older. Of note, only 2% were under the age of 25, which again is really not unusual because anytime an assessment takes place, those who are older tend to jump in and do that much more quickly than those who are younger. Race and ethnic background, 87% of the respondents are white, 9% African American. Education, you're a well-educated church, at least 54% of the respondents have a college degree. Marital status, 74% are married, and when you include others who have been divorced or remarried, we're up to 80%. And then employment status, 42% working full-time, 40% retired. That's really quick, but gives you a bit of demographic background for those who took the assessment. And then one final slide, a comparison of, can you go ahead and hit that next one? Yeah, a comparison of how the church responded versus how your elders responded. And pretty well responded in the same way in terms of overall percentages. Many times when a church does the church health assessment, it's almost like the church leadership has on colored glasses. They don't look realistically, and so they may score much higher than the church does. And so what a blessing again to see a church and its leaders scoring very, very close to one another. All right, thanks for bearing with me. Not the most exciting kind of presentation that you anticipate coming to church for, but hopefully at least a snapshot of how you responded to the assessment. And if you're a guest with us today, thanks for being patient with us as well. And hopefully you walk away hearing that this church is a healthy church. I think a place that I'd be willing to explore if I were moving to Summerville, South Carolina. And so thank you again for the opportunity to be with you. I was told to be through by 9:45. I've given you 1 minute. Thank you very much.